Hello, thank you for watching this video. This video is intended to explain how the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy completed a detailed review that culminated in a vote to tentatively adopt amendments to the sentencing matrices for drug and property offenses. The goal of the video is to explain the purpose for the guidelines, to provide a rationale for the guidelines review, to summarize the proposed amendments, and to bring transparency to the review process. So let's get started by reviewing a few of the basic principles regarding the Maryland sentencing guidelines. First, the sentencing guidelines in Maryland are voluntary. Judges may, at their discretion, depart from the guidelines. Second, the guidelines are also intended to be primarily descriptive. That is, the guidelines are intended to describe or reflect actual sentencing practices. The descriptive nature of the guidelines means they are not intended to be static. Rather, they are dynamic, and the guidelines may be amended when the data indicate that sentences are not consistent with the recommended guidelines range. So what do we mean by descriptive guidelines? Descriptive guidelines are those that are informed by analysis of actual current sentencing practices. Guidelines that are primarily descriptive are not intended to tell judges how they should sentence. Rather, they are intended to illustrate to judges how their colleagues are sentencing on average for a typical case. This is accomplished by analyzing recent historical sentencing data and using that data to inform or describe the guidelines ranges. Given the primarily descriptive nature of the guidelines, it is important to examine if sentences are consistent with the current guidelines ranges. Guidelines compliance review is statutorily required by the Commission's enabling legislation, and it is one of the primary responsibilities of the Sentencing Commission. The Commission's annual reports provide detailed analyses of compliance with the guidelines by crime category, judicial circuit, and other measures. Additionally, the Sentencing Commission periodically completes a more detailed cell-by-cell analysis every 3 to 5 years. I will take a moment to describe what is meant by a cell-by-cell analysis. A cell is the grid intersection of an individual's offender score and offense seriousness category for drug and property offenses, or offense score for person offenses within the respective sentencing guidelines matrices. Let's consider an example of a cell range from the current matrix for drug offenses. This is a partial view of the current drug offense matrix showing the recommended guidelines for seriousness category 7 drug offenses. I have circled the cell which illustrates the corresponding grid intersection for offender score 3 seriousness category 7 offenses, indicating a recommended guidelines range of probation to 1 month, or P to 1 month. The cell-by-cell compliance analysis reviews data for sentences from each of the intersecting grid cells of the 3 matrices to consider whether changes to the guidelines ranges are warranted. The Commission's current review examines single count sentencing data from calendar years 2018 through 2020. This timing allowed for the collection of 3 full calendar years of sentencing guidelines data following the Justice Reinvestment Act and corresponding October 2017 revisions to the seriousness categories for many common property and drug offenses. The analysis looked at average sentence and compliance by cell. As noted here, it looked at strict and regular compliance. Strict compliance considers a sentence compliant only if the sentences, not including suspended time, falls within the recommended guidelines range, while regular compliance provides additional allowances for sentences involving corrections options, guidelines compliant pleas, and credited time. As a first step in the review, the subcommittee examined both regular and strict compliance rates for each cell of the current matrices, with particular attention paid to cells with rates below the 65% benchmark standard and those with a sufficient sample size of at least 50 total cases. So let's review what we mean by the 65% benchmark standard. The descriptive nature of the guidelines originated from the Judicial Committee on Sentencing that first developed and proposed guidelines to the Maryland Judicial Conference. In 1991, the Sentencing Guidelines Revision Committee of the Judiciary's Guidelines Advisory Board established an expectation that 2/3 of sentences would fall within the recommended sentencing range. And when sentencing practice resulted in departure from the recommended range in more than 1/3 of cases, guidelines revisions should be considered. Based on this previously adopted policy, the Commission adopted the goal of 65% as the benchmark standard for sentencing guidelines compliance. Findings from the first step of the review were reported at the May 2021 Sentencing Commission meeting. The first step considered compliance and strict compliance by matrix and cell. The primary takeaway was that most of the cells with at least 50 cases are meeting the 65% compliance benchmark, as regular compliance is below the 65% benchmark in only 2.2% of all cells across the 3 matrices. However, when considering strict compliance, more than 1/4 of those cells have compliance rates less than 65%. Further, in the majority of the non-compliant cells, departures below the guidelines exceeded departures above the guideline. The next step in the review was to examine where the middle 65% of sentences fall for each cell. By identifying the middle 65% and considering revisions to more closely align with the middle 65%, we can achieve 2 things. First, we know that the 65% compliance benchmark will be met if we identify that range, the range that captures the middle 65% of sentences. Second, we know that the middle 65% will reflect the average or middle sentence for a particular cell while excluding outlier sentences on either end of the range. Accordingly, the guidelines will help inform about the average sentence for a typical case. This graph illustrates the middle 65% for the intersecting grid cell of the drug matrix for seriousness category 3B offenses with an offender score of 1. The blue portion of the graph illustrates the 496 sentences in calendar years 2018 through 2020 in this particular cell. As you can see, the majority of the sentences fall in the range between 0 months to 18 months. Although not illustrated on this graph, another 17.5% of sentences are at 0 months, and an additional 17.5% are above 18 months. In instances when the lower limit of the middle 65% is probation or 0 months, as it is with this particular cell, this simply indicates that the bottom 17.5% of sentences is also probation. The current guidelines for this cell are set to 1 year to 3 years, but as you can see, a smaller percentage of sentences fall in the current range. The middle 65% analysis was completed for each of the cells in the drug and property matrices. The next step of the review considered proposed amendments to the drug and property matrices and examined how compliance rates would change with those revisions. The proposed revisions strike a balance between a strictly descriptive middle 65% of current sentences, the number of months in each range, and the proportionality of ranges across cells. The proposed revisions move the guidelines substantially closer to the middle 65%. However, they do not correspond strictly to the middle 65%, as they also offer proportional incremental increases going across the matrix as the offender criminal history score increases, and down the matrix as the offense severity increases. So let's consider the proposed revisions to the sentencing matrix for drug offenses. At this point, I would like you to take a look at this slide or this illustration here that provides a summary for the proposed revisions to the drug matrix. Within this summary illustration here, there's 3 rows of information that are illustrated for each cell. Row 1 in the red font provides the middle 65% of sentences with the total number of cases for the cell noted in parentheses. Row 2 in the blue font provides the current guidelines range and the number of months between lower and upper ranges. Row 3 provides the proposed guidelines range and the number of months between the lower and upper ranges. Cells highlighted in yellow have a strict compliance rate less than 65% and at least 50 cases, while cells highlighted in light blue have a strict compliance rate less than 65% and fewer than 50 cases. The yellow highlighting that you see throughout this matrix here indicates that there are now 9 cells with at least 50 cases where the strict compliance rate is less than 65%. This is compared with 15 cells in the current matrix, so the proposed revisions would result in higher compliance rates. Further, although not illustrated here, all of the revised cells with 50 or more cases would have a regular compliance rate of greater than 65%. Now, this is a lot of information for one slide, so let's take a closer look at just one cell here. And we're going to look at the cell that corresponds with an offender score of 1 and a seriousness category of 3B. This screenshot provides the closer look at the information contained within the highlighted cell for a seriousness category 3B offense with an offender score of 1. Again, the first row of the cell in red font indicates the middle 65% of sentences for the cell. And in this instance, the middle 65% is probation to 1 year, 1.5 years, or 18 months. And the number of sentences in the cell during calendar years 2018 through 2020 was 496, as shown in parentheses. The second row in blue indicates the current guidelines range is 1 to 3 years, with 24 months between the lower and upper ranges. And the yellow highlighting indicates that fewer than 65% of sentences are within that range. The third row in green indicates the proposed range is probation to 18 months. And the absence of yellow highlighting here indicates that at least 65% of sentences are within that range. Accordingly, the proposed revisions would change this cell so that more than 65% of sentences are strictly compliant with the guidelines. Now let's consider the proposed revisions to the sentencing matrix for property offenses. Looking at this illustration of the summary of the proposed revisions, you can see the yellow highlighting throughout indicates that there are 6 cells with at least 50 cases where strict compliance is less than 65%. Now that is compared with 14 cells in the current matrix. Further, all of the revised cells with at least 50 cases have a regular compliance rate of 65%. And I will again highlight one of these cells to take a closer look. I picked the cell corresponding with an offender score of 3 and a seriousness category of 6. So we'll take a closer look at this particular cell here. Screenshot provides a closer look at the information contained in this highlighted cell. The red font here, the first row in the red font, indicates the middle 65% of sentences for this cell is probation to 1 year. And the number of sentences in this cell during calendar years 2018 to 2020 was 56, which is shown there in parentheses. The second row in blue indicates the current guidelines range is 6 months to 2 years, with 18 months between the lower and upper ranges. And the yellow highlighting indicates that fewer than 65% of sentences are within that range. The third row in green indicates that the proposed range is probation to 1 year. And the absence of yellow highlighting again indicates that at least 65% of sentences are within that range. So the proposed revisions would change this cell so that more than 65% of sentences are compliant with the guidelines. Now, before we get into wrapping up this discussion, I thought it would be helpful to address a few common questions that have been raised about the proposed revisions. The first question is, are the proposed revisions intended to reduce sentences for drug offenders, particularly those convicted of drug distribution? And the answer is the proposed guidelines revisions are not intended to reduce sentences, and revisions to the guidelines are not intended to change sentencing. Rather, the proposed revisions amend the guidelines to more accurately reflect recent sentencing trends. In other words, the proposed revisions more closely align the guidelines with how judges are currently sentencing. I want to emphasize that the sentencing guidelines are not intended to say what judges should do or to say what sentences the state should recommend. The guidelines are intended to reflect the average sentence that is actually imposed or that has actually been imposed based on analysis of sentencing guidelines data. Further, I think it is important to remember that the guidelines remain voluntary and judges retain the option to sentence above or below the guidelines when the facts of the case call for an increase or decreased sentence. The second question to consider is whether the proposed revisions reflect sentencing discounts due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The answer is no. The Sentencing Commission specifically examined this question. The analysis identified that approximately 13% of sentencing events in the 3-year time period from 2018 to 2020 occurred during COVID, and there were very few differences in strict compliance by matrix and cell when those sentences were excluded, with strict compliance rates generally varying by no more than a few percentage points. In summary, the inclusion of 10 months of data from the start of the pandemic does not alter guideline sentencing trends for this 3-year time period, and therefore the Sentencing Commission included all sentencing events for calendar years 2018 to 2020 to maximize the number of sentencing events that are informing the current review. The final question to address is, do the proposed revisions reflect sentencing trends statewide, or do they reflect sentences from 1 or 2 larger jurisdictions? The answer is that the proposed revisions are based on analysis of statewide sentencing trends. The guidelines are intended for statewide use and are not intended to reflect jurisdiction-specific sentencing. There was some concern specifically that the proposed guidelines for the 3B drug offenses may be skewed or too heavily influenced by sentences from the 8th Judicial Circuit, as that particular circuit accounts for a disproportionate number of 3B drug offense sentencings. Accordingly, an analysis was completed to examine the sentences for 3B offenses separately from the A circuit versus all the other circuits. This analysis found that the average sentence in the A circuit trend lower. However, the sentences in the other jurisdiction also trend lower than the current guidelines ranges, confirming that proposed revisions are warranted. Further, the proposed revisions are more aligned with the sentences from the other jurisdictions than the sentences in the A circuit, which should eliminate the concern that the proposed revisions are being driven by trends from a particular jurisdiction. After completing the multi-stage review that was summarized in this video, the Sentencing Commission voted on November 10th, 2021 to tentatively approve proposed revisions to the drug and property matrices subject to input at the December 7, 2021 public hearing. The primary rationale for supporting the proposed revisions is that the guidelines are most meaningful and relevant when they are regularly reviewed and when they are consistent with current sentencing trends. The Sentencing Commission's bylaws permit the Commission to, among other things, approve a proposed action subject to receiving public comment. Accordingly, the Commission is calling for public comments at its public comments hearing to be held on December 7th, 2021. Pending the outcome of the public comments hearing, the Commission may vote to officially adopt proposed revisions to the drug and property matrices at the Commission's business meeting that will immediately follow the public hearing on December 7th. The tentative amendments may be viewed on the Commission's website at the link shown here. Additionally, you can access instructions on how to register to speak at the hearing via the Commission's website at the link also shown on this screen. For more information about the guidelines in general or about the work of the Sentencing Commission, please visit the Commission's website at MSCCSP.org. Also, please feel free to contact the Commission via phone or via email. Thank you for joining us for this video.